Just a thought. One thing that seems to cut across many of your categories is a form of kind of intense cooperative action. In other words, both parties are intensely looking at what each other is doing, like the one of the adolescence where you're doing it. And then at various points, different kinds of pedagogical modifications arise within that framework. And it's not the case for all of them, and frequently, which I don't think is what Gergely was arguing, the interaction is simultaneous as well as sequential. You don't just wait to see what somebody did and do it next, but you're doing this simultaneously. So I'm just wondering if that kind of a cooperative framework, which would also organize attention so that you could see what the other was trying to do and assess their success, if that would be like an infrastructure in which many of these separate techniques are emerging.
No, that'd be great. I mean, that one thing about the is that the infants are incredibly motivated. The parents are not so motivated. I mean, that the kids want to learn and do more than the parents are able and willing to do. The kids are in the lab, they're playing the musical instrument, and the kids are sort of just, so that the energy levels of and the motivations by the kids are just to learn are just, they're all over the place, and they're incredibly, but that sort of much closer attention to sort of like the cooperative nature.
Hey, I'm interested in whether or not you observed any type of teaching with regard to things that might be called kind of mother nature. So things like instructing a young adolescent who's just had her first infant how to lactate, let's say, how to breastfeed her infant. Or is that something that's just mostly, and if you have, is it mostly just through observation and imitation, or?
Again, I mean, that it's, from what I've seen, I mean, that it's just, there's not that much sort of, there's not the sort of verbal, I mean, that much of it is the observation, but again, the data, I mean, that in terms of, my wife has attended a birth. Generally, guys don't attend births, and so I have not attended, even though they're right there, right in the forest, right close by. But guys generally do not. But I would be surprised if there wasn't. I mean, when you ask kids, and you ask them how they learn, they generally say, "My mother taught me." But there are problems with interview data. That's why I wanted to do something observational, find out really what actually goes on.
I think there must be, since so many women today have so much trouble with it, and they don't get a lot of the exposure to.
But those are women who haven't seen a lot of other.
Right. That's what I was wondering, is if it's just by seeing it, women could learn it, or whether or not additional instruction was given. But I guess we don't know.
You don't see much instruction in that particular realm, but obviously it would need to be, it would need to be videotapes specific to that, especially at childbirth. I mean, that'd be great.
So it seems like one thing that you're saying, just the comparison between the farmers and the hunter-gatherers, is that there's more access to all the communities going on in the hunter-gatherers. Is that true, that there's more private behavior?
There's more private behavior in the farmers. Their houses are private, whereas the kids, the kids in the Aka camp just move in and out of the houses. But there's a lot of movement as well. The farmers, not in the houses, not in that. In the farming communities, the house is private, but that's not true among the hunter-gatherers.
It seems like both that question of what you can see, and then also the taboos against touching, or like here they're very physical in terms of how they're teaching, and then they're not using language. So it seems like both of those things, separation physically and privacy, would make language more useful, because you have to fill in the blanks, whereas here they're just...
No, that's sort of would be a working hypothesis. I mean, that, that's what that's, why I sort of talk about co-sleeping, so that the communication through co-sleeping is clearly sort of going on from what we know, so that you have all these other subtle forms. but clearly the farmers use more verbal kinds of instruction.
So the fact that you see teaching dropping off after infancy seems like that makes sense given that the egalitarian norms of not telling people what to do. If people are treating babies as maybe not full people or sort of an exception to the rule of not telling anyone what to do. Is there an
Well,
age
yeah, it's
at
not
which,
so much that they're, yeah, right, yeah.
Is there an age at which that seems to flip?
At 8. I mean, I just do
Yeah.
one sort
But
of.
do people, I mean, is there any of your just ethnographic knowledge that suggests that, like, at 2 years old or something, people start giving respect to kids that they give
No, I don't
to?
know. I don't know if it's a matter of giving respect, but I mean, it's sort of like age appropriate type, sort of like, and so that whatever type of taxonomy that we would develop, that it would need to be developmentally sort of appropriate and sort of like, I don't, that maybe that as kids their strength increases, their physical, mental abilities change, and so that the input from others just.
I wondered if the number of bouts of teaching is really a great measure of the amount of learning, because that pattern is what we would expect, because the efficiency at which a human learns obviously increases over time.
Right.
You need a lot of hand-holding when you're 4 months, I guess, but not when you're 8. And this society, my observation in general, has a much lower age of onset of competency or mastery over the basic thing. So we would expect a curve to go down and to diminish, into adolescence.
Right. Well, yeah, what we find is from Adam's work in middle childhood is that in terms of being taught, decline slowly, and as you get older, you start to be it goes up. You become the instructor, you become the teacher. So that goes up, so that
So do adults elicit teaching from each other? Like, do they ask each other questions about how do you do this?
No, I mean that if you're sort of, again, it's sort of like by going and observing. So if you're an adult, you want to learn a particularly new dance, you go and you watch and that you participate. That there may, again, I don't know for sure. I mean, in the sense that, so you would imagine something subtle, some little verbal component to it.
Right. I mean, one of the stories that's told in ethnography about why people don't ask questions is, especially in Polynesia, there's a really strict hierarchy.
Right.
And it's supposed to be received as a challenge to the person you're asking the question to, and it's also embarrassing to admit that you don't know it. But if you're seeing the same pattern in a society where that's not necessarily true,
Yeah, there's no.
then there's some other reason that potentially that teaching is dropping off.
Everybody knows everything.
Maybe.
Right?
I mean,
if there's not much division of specialization, why would you ask?
well, but people know, I mean, I've done surveys of how much people know about different things like traditional medicine or fishing, and people agree that some people know more than others, and yet still they're not going and asking some people, supposedly. I haven't studied that with adults either, so.
Well, it seems like these, you might say, non-functional kinds of behaviors, like different dance forms. You said that people are encouraged to innovate.
Right.
And are there some people who are more likely to be imitated in these kind of aesthetic behaviors than other people?
But there are certain people who are known as innovators. That, they have a word, they have to describe particular people who are very creative, and so that there's a word in that, and they can be creative. It's really interesting because they tend to be creative across the spectrum of different sort of domains, and so they seek out, the adolescents in particular, seek out these particular people with these sort of characteristics of being creative.
Thanks.
Yeah, your comments earlier about the cultural anthropology dogma that there's not a lot of teaching or much of any teaching going on,
Right.
it does seem to me it comes a little bit from a false model of classrooms, and the idea of a teacher, the question-response model of teaching is that I know the question and the answer, and you're only going to hear the question,
Right.
which is absolutely untrue in most of the world.
Right.
But, and you have a formal role, and you have teacher-student hierarchy. So, are there classrooms in this region? So are people at least aware of that institution, but yet have not decided to model it or try it out or practice it, literacy acquisitions, for example, in their everyday life? Because I think that's where a lot of this comes from, that, oh, we don't have teaching because for the formal school model, it wouldn't count.
Right, right, yeah. No, but they've definitely seen this school.
Okay,
I mean, there's a school in the village, and so that they've asked me to build a school. But there is a school in the village that they see the kids, the village kids, the farming kids go to school. And the thing is about, the social anthropologists, they make important contributions, and I understand sort of where they're coming from. Like my own work with fathers is just sort of like, well, you have the Western folks, and then you have like, then you have the Aka, and you don't have that model with, and therefore, it's sort of a way to reject sort of like what's common in sort of like the West. And I think that the social anthropologists, cultural anthropologists are trying to do the same thing, trying to emphasize the nature of small scale cultures. But for me, I want to use the definition from evolutionary biology, just as we did with culture. That a lot of people got upset when we said that there was chimp culture, and when it first came out, people were really upset with that. And, well, chimps don't have culture; only humans have culture. But once culture was defined, but then through that process, we come now to understand how human culture is distinct from that of ape culture, and we have these. And I think the same thing in terms of teaching, that we start from a baseline in terms of identifying, starting from this evolutionary biology type of definition, and then try to understand what is really unique about human teaching. What are the features that make human teaching, unique? But this idea of social and cultural anthropology, it doesn't exist, this is useless. And I get kind of tired of it after a while, because I've seen David Lancy in many places. Nope, doesn't exist. And he knows the Gyorgy and Csibra, and he knows where we're coming from. He says, nope, doesn't exist.
Well, from a socialization or enculturation perspective, it's crazy because that the process of bringing up a child is the intentional design of a psychologically salient and meaningful environment towards some goal. There's some direction you want this development to go. You want the kids to learn to use you. You want them to take care of other kids. So by that definition, of course there's going to be directed, intentionally structured situations. And so I think your video and other data are incredibly valuable.
Thanks. So I realize you compressed a lot of material into a short period of time. And there's a bit of a conflict between two different things that you said, and I'm hoping that you can flesh it out just on the basis of your observations, if not quantitative data. So you've told us, on the one hand, that older children, young adults, don't ask a lot of questions. When you ask them how it is that they learned something, they say that they learned it from so-and-so. But when you watch what they actually do, they just go and watch a lot. But you've also told us that if somebody innovates and a learner wants to acquire innovation, then there's a cultural schema in which there's some kind of reciprocation made, right? That is, some gift needs to be brought and so on. Well, if I know that Joe has come up with a new way of doing something, and I want to acquire it from Joe, and there's no expectation on my part that I will ask questions or that Joe will answer them, and that I'm going to acquire it only by watching Joe, then I'm not imposing any costs on Joe. So it seems odd that Joe would have the expectation that I should pay for access. So the fact that there is a cultural schema in which gifts are brought by learners to innovators suggests that there is more of an imposition by the learner on the innovator than the I learn by watching schema would lead you to believe. And that makes me think probably there's more modeling, there's more question and answer, because otherwise, where would the gift expectation come from?
Well, I mean, it's the gift is, I mean, hanging out and actually having time and energy with that person, with that particular type of knowledge. And
Right,
so,
but if you just go and visit someone, is there an expectation that you bring them a gift? So if Joe's just,
No,
you know,
right.
in another band and I
No,
just
right.
don't see him. And
know that the idea that this is cool, this is new stuff, and so that especially the adolescents, like, and so that, but you're, from what I've seen, it's mostly just hanging out. I mean, that there's very, you know, the basket sort of thing was sort of that does happen, and so that was a little bit, that's more direct, more directed, but I guess that I'm just surprised how much it's not. I think that, I mean, and again, what I really want to try to emphasize, we don't have the data, and so that, but anecdotally, I just am impressed with how little explanation sort of actually takes place, and that's my own bias for my own culture.
You mentioned creativity in forms of dancing, for instance, but how much creativity is there when it comes to productive activities? How much variability there is in the productive activities?
Like in a fairly regular, I mean, in terms of a you know, a new way to make a crossbow, a new way to do a basket. You're absolutely right. A lot of it, you know, especially for the adolescents here or there, it's music and dance. But that certainly it's on a fairly regular basis. But you know, what the mathematical modeling points out is that a lot of those things, you know, that, you know, in terms of don't take off. I mean, that they don't take what, you know, they just simply don't take off. You have innovation all the time. The Aqua way of life, I mean, that really people are doing new steps, doing new, I mean, in terms of music and dance, they're finding new ways to get down trees, they're testing new plants for particular medicines. But a lot of those, you know, never get transmitted. So what we focused on are the successful innovations.
Just going off with what Dan was saying, there's ways in which sharing can be, well, sharing can reduce your own relative advantage in a variety of ways. So depending on, it could be not costly in the sense like you can continue to produce what you're doing without any cost to yourself immediately. But if you're increasing the other person's relative capacity to produce something, so it depends on, it could depend on whether or not these baskets are used for trade, you know, whether or not they're...
Sure, but this is in a society that has strict norms of distribution, right? So that your produce is, the expectation is that what you have is shared with others. So the idea that, you know, I have to pay Joe in order to look over his shoulder because my looking over his shoulder decreases his relative advantage is inconsistent with a norm that says that whatever advantage Joe has, he has to distribute to me.
Yeah, you can just, I mean, the thing is, it is amazing. I mean, and I can't. I mean, because basically somebody wants to walk up to somebody who has that new basket, you're supposed to give it to them.
Right. So, I mean, I would say the logic of what you're saying is going to hold true
for many places, but in a place with a leveling norm as extreme as this, it seems inconsistent. Right?
It is true that if you don't have a basket to give them immediately, then they can't have it. But if you give it to them, then they can. If they know how to make it, then they can produce their own. Things like that.
I mean, obviously, there's a prestige economy here, right? So that there's a term for people who are highly creative. Their reputations. People travel distances to be near them, right?
And even that's something that can be transferred. Like if I teach someone something that I never made, then I have that.
I mean, one question is whether, if I learn it from Joe and I teach it to Bailey, does Bailey know that I learned it from Joe? That is, does Joe continue to get prestige by virtue of the innovation as it's transmitted?
Generally, it's tracked when it's early.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. Right? So, I mean, all of that suggests that Joe should be giving it away if it doesn't take any time or energy for Joe for me to learn. And that leads me to think that it does, that he answers my question.
You talked throughout the presentation about, well, how do you classify these behaviors, these different teaching acts or behaviors? And one possibility would be, this idea from Mel Conner, the culture acquisition devices that we have. And so the modality would be one way to classify them. For instance, attentional and perceptual processes, emotional or affective ways. Like, hey, this is important.
Right.
Another would be sociolinguistic, the lexical label flow. Is there some phrase or narrative that's used for it? Another way would be cognitive, the theory of mind, or memory. So you could classify them by the likely processes through which these things exist anyway. Like, why are children so voracious acquirers of culture? Well, these modalities have evolved, and you can classify the different
those modalities
that way, and then see if when and where they are going.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I like that.
Are there any individual innovators that refuse to teach or to allow people to watch them and participate?
I've never seen that. I've never seen somebody.
It would be bad Haka behavior, right?
It'd be bad. Yeah, no, I mean that. I'm trying to think of, in terms of among the Ngadu, I would definitely say that. Among the Ngadu, in terms of refusing. I mean that the thing is that there are certain things that are done more among the Ngadu. There are a few things that are done in private, and that is certain medicines out in the forest. So you're sort of walking and you may take particular medicines out in the forest, and so that it's interesting that anyway, you find this incredible diversity in terms of medical knowledge between individuals where you have, and so that you have certain individuals who have a lot of sort of specialty knowledge, so that it seems to be, you would think that it would be sort of generalized, but you have particular individuals who are treating people for certain things, but it's not out there to be seen as conducted in the forest.
I remember from one of the graphs, you were showing things for the middle group. There's 3 different graphs in terms of showing the relationship between relatives versus non-relatives.
Right.
It seemed like it was going from when it's kind of information, when the interaction is one that's fairly close between the 2 individuals, and the learning is primarily from relatives, very little from the outside, and then you get to more.
Yeah, there are 3 sort of categories there. One category was parents, vertical transmission. One was other relatives, and the third one was non-relatives.
Right. And there was a regular change in the non-relatives as you went from those things, learning, which was much more intimate between the 2 individuals, to where it's much more, let's say, less personal between the 2 individuals. I mean, it seems like that's a theme that keeps coming up over and over again, over the importance or the role that kin relations are playing with respect to the interaction between the individuals and the kind of learning processes that are going on, where you have an expectation that some things are better or ought to be transmitted, say in a close family context, and as you move forward, there's different kinds of things that get transmitted. Right. I think in terms of our own notion of teaching in a formal setting, we often have a conflict in the society between what the family has expectations about its socialization, its enculturation of its children on the one side, versus what the schools are doing, and the schools are not seen as a substitute for doing that kind of culture. Rather, it can be a conflict if they try to engage in it at all. And I wonder whether that would be a useful way to sort of also be looking at it in terms of sort of the different modalities of teaching and what is being taught according to those kinds of differences.
Yeah, and we can look at that. The thing is, clearly, I mean, we know from developmental psychology that not just, I mean, that when you're with parents, I mean, that you're sort of, one is you're stuck there. And so that you have, they're low cost in terms, I mean, that you don't have access to it. And the thing is, at 4 to 5 years of age, kids are able to evaluate, you have the trust in terms of development of that trust with parents, but kids start to evaluate others and then go for those who have more particular knowledge. And so that at 4 to 5 years of age, so that they are able to evaluate, and also they're more mobile to move out.
Okay, thanks.